everyone? My name is Spencer Walsh. Welcome to today's show. We have a good one for you, as always. On the show today, the news you have been hearing a lot about, but not quite the full story. We're going to try to give you the full story succinctly about this UN Security Council resolution, what it means, what it says, how different it is, and how both sides are responding. Just specifically what all that calls for. Also, we have more and more angles coming in on this whole Israel-Gaza situation. The State Department has found no evidence, and it almost just it makes you just kind of have to do like that Joker, I'm about to go insane laugh as you hear this headline. Like, there's no evidence that Israel has been violating laws with U.S. weapons, according to the State Department. Also, I'm going to give you some of the latest on continued Israeli besiegement of hospitals. The New York Times, again, dodging, but kind of showing the fact that they've made a major screw-up when it came to October 7th and their rape reporting. Also, an effort by police unions to remove a cop from office, remove a progressive prosecutor from office, or district attorney, by the name of Mary Moriarty in Minnesota. And we'll give you a little bit of good news, I guess if you're a Democrat, if you want Joe Biden to desperately win, to end out the show today. Well, it's good news, I guess, if you're anti-Trump, which in my opinion we all should be. All right, so we have to start at the top, though, with the UN Security Council demanding an immediate ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian group Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the release of all hostages in the United States as the United States abstains from the vote. So, essentially, immediate ceasefire, long-lasting ceasefire. 14 other council members voted in favor of the resolution, which was proposed by the 10 elected members of the council. There was a round of applause in the council chamber after the vote. So, again, it calls for a ceasefire in the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan, which ends in 2 weeks. So, essentially, even only a 2-week ceasefire, really. I think it's important to put in perspective. It's not, anything like a long-lasting ceasefire that Hamas has made indications that they would prefer in the negotiations, and also demands release of all hostages seized in the Hamas-led attack on southern Israel on October 7th. This bloodbath has continued for far too long, said Amar Ben-Jamah, ambassador from Algeria. They're Bloc's current Security Council member and sponsor of the resolution. Finally, the Security Council, and I think, we all really know who he's really talking about when he says the Security Council is shouldering its responsibility. The U.S. Has repeatedly blocked the Security Council resolutions that put pressure on Israel, but has increasingly shown frustration with its ally as civilian casualties mount, and the UN warns of impending famine in Gaza. That framing there is from Al Jazeera, and I think it is somewhat instructive, because what this calls for is immediate release of all hostages unconditionally and a 2-week ceasefire, which is honestly in some ways immediate 2-week ceasefire. I don't know, would they wait a certain period of time before putting in the 2-week ceasefire? I don't know. There's no broader framework for peace, just a 2-week ceasefire, release of the hostages, which is honestly essentially what the U.S. has been saying, but arguably below what the U.S. has been saying when it comes to this. And we've also heard, some calls for maybe a 6-week ceasefire, but, essentially in line with what the U.S. has been saying. Not a very revolutionary or very impactful resolution, but it is noteworthy because it's the first time the U.S. has not outright vetoed a resolution calling for any U.S. ceasefire. So we're really taking baby steps here. Just the idea of a ceasefire could be, processed in some way as possible and good by the United Nations. Speaking after the vote, U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield blamed Hamas for the delay in passing a ceasefire resolution. We did not agree with everything with the resolution, which she said was the reason why the U.S. abstained. Certain key edits were ignored, including our request to add a condemnation of Hamas. Of course, I think we already passed a resolution condemning Hamas about 2-3 months ago in the Security Council. She stressed that the release of Israeli captives would lead to an increase in humanitarian aid supplies going to the besieged coastal enclave. Again, no evidence of that, and also really no evidence that they have any ability to impact, the U.S. does, to impact the amount of humanitarian aid that's coming into the Gaza Strip. especially with essentially just taking their cues and orders from Netanyahu, which almost is a bad way to say it, because those two are working on partnership. Because again, it comes back to the framework that I always say, which is they're both playing a PR game. United States trying to soothe its anxious population, which is anxious about the security or the civilian casualties, by saying, "Oh, we're going to try and get Israel to do this. We're telling them to do this. We're making them do that." And they're just sending a concerned letter, doing a press release here and there. But when it comes down to it, is not really having any effect, and essentially giving the cover for Israel to continue doing exactly what the hell it wants in the Gaza Strip. And Israel, kind of conversely, and we see that in its reaction, is standing up to, in almost a hyper hysterical way, any of those U.S. and if from the perspective of Netanyahu is standing up in this very hyper aggressive, hysterical way to any of these U.S. reprimands, these concern letters, these calls for more aid, these calls for this, calls for that, with no actual weight behind them, because Netanyahu has to show to his incredibly right-wing base and his coalition that he is going to be standing up to the United States and their kind of weak-mindedness and, pursuing, as he calls it, total victory in the Gaza Strip. So you can see that. And you can kind of also see here in the United States in this exchange with Matt Lee and Matt Miller. Matt Lee, the AP reporter, and Matt Miller, the State Department spokesperson, about how exactly the UN views this.
Referred to the
okay, but the abstention means that you're okay with it. You're willing to go along with it, and so what do you expect now to happen as a result of the passage of this resolution?
So I think,
do you expect that Israel is going to announce a ceasefire?
I do not.
Do you expect that Hamas is going to release hostages?
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that we have objected to for some time is that most of the people that call for a ceasefire, we believe, are calling for Israel to unilaterally stop operations and not calling for Hamas to agree to a ceasefire where they would release hostages.
Well, I think it goes both ways, doesn't it?
It could, but so
But
the resolution today is a non-binding resolution. But
okay, so what's the point?
Well,
why did you abstain? Why didn't you veto?
We didn't veto because we thought the language in it was consistent with something that. The language as it relates to the ceasefire and release of hostage was consistent with the longstanding United States position.
So you don't believe anything is going to happen as a result of the passage of this resolution?
So I think that separate and apart from this resolution, we have active, ongoing negotiations to try to achieve what this resolution calls for, which is an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages. I can't say that this resolution is going to have any impact on those negotiations. But those negotiations are ongoing. They've been ongoing over the weekend, and they've made progress.
So I don't expect you to answer this now, but to me, you just stick this in your pocket. If that's the case, what the hell is the point of the UN, or the UN Security Council?
So we think it plays an important role.
It does, even though its action does absolutely nothing.
And he's got a disgusting little smirk on his face, Matt Miller, as he's answering this. But yeah, you do see the let's finish the rest of the clip.
Yeah. What you would like to see, not out of the UN, but out of discussions in Doha.
So we believe it's important that the UN speak and the UN Security Council speak on matters of international security. It's why we've been engaged in this process. It's why we thought we were going to have a successful vote on Friday that Russia and China, unfortunately and quite cynically, vetoed. But I do believe that ultimately, if we are able to achieve a ceasefire and the release of hostages, is going to come not through a UN process, but through the process with which we've been engaged, in Doha.
Yeah, so essentially saying UN here does not matter. It's not going to make any major effect, but we are calling for a ceasefire. So kind of being honest, but also being, a little bit dishonest in holding up the fantasy of these negotiations that the U.S. is pushing Israel towards a ceasefire in a way that would require it to give up any of its aims, any of its war goals, any of its desires in what it wants to do in the Gaza Strip, which we have seen absolutely no hard evidence of based on their actions. By both the U.S. or both responsive actions to U.S. pressure, by the Israelis, and so it really does make this whole exchange, relatively pointless. And again, a big PR exercise because the U.S., they get to, all the headlines of U.S. abstains, Israeli tensions are on the rise between the United States and Israel. Netanyahu, in his kind of hysterical counter reaction, as we talked about before, is now not sending a delegation over to Washington to talk about how they were going to invade Rafah. Apparently now there's in the plans some sort of delegation to go to Washington, meet with U.S., talk about their plans for Rafah, sort it all out, and talk about, God knows what, and then apparently come out and say, oh, we're talking with Israel about how they're going to minimize civilian casualties after. That whole PR exercise is not going to happen because this whole PR exercise of we're having these ceasefire negotiations, we're having this resolution vote. We're not even going to vote for it. We're going to abstain. Then we get the headlines of U.S. challenging Israel. Again, as Matt Miller rather honestly says here, will come to no effect in the end and have no effect on any of these negotiations. So, again, it is good to see some of that rare honesty from Matt Miller, but also lumped in with a whole heap of dishonesty as well. Here's a pretty crazy one. The State Department said on Monday that it found no evidence that Israel is violating a recent directive that recipients of U.S. military aid comply with international human rights law. In February, partly due to pressure over support for Israel's war in Gaza, the Biden administration issued a national security memo that required any armed country receiving military aid from Washington while participating in an active armed conflict to issue credible, reliable, written assurances that they will use weapons funded by the U.S. in accordance with international law and that they will the recipient country will facilitate and not arbitrarily deny, restrict, or otherwise impede directly or indirectly the transport or delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance and United States government-supported international efforts to provide humanitarian assistance. Sunday was the deadline for Israel, along with 6 other countries deemed to meet the criteria, including Colombia, Iraq, Kenya, Nigeria, Somalia, and Ukraine, to meet these assurances. For these 7 countries, we have received written assurances that are required in the memo, Matt Miller said during this press briefing on Monday. In each case, these assurances were made by a credible, high-level official in the partner government who has the ability and authority to make decisions and commitments about the issues at the heart of the assurances. So essentially saying, we'll take your word for it when it comes to a lot of these countries. I don't think there's any other, major country that had their aid cut off for failing to meet these assurances, which I think is pretty telling. You have essentially what happened is you can kind of imagine is they just sent this over and said, to someone in the Netanyahu government, someone in the war government, are you going to be using these in accordance with international law? They didn't do any kind of fact-checking on their own. They didn't do any sort of kind of internal U.S. investigation within the State Department or anything like that. I think that is how you reach this really absolutely utterly, completely bonkers claim that there has been no U.S. weapons, despite pictures coming out, and this is one of the most unforgettable moments, I think, of the entire situation, is the pictures coming out of the U.S. markings on the bombs that were used to kill the 6-year-old Hind Rajab in the car about a month or so ago by IDF forces. So it is very clear. That is just one example. And we've seen over, Washington Post reporting this over the weekend, there's been over 100 separate kind of weapons transfers, and especially some of the most critical guided munitions, which is really the area that, according to this Washington Post report, that Israel lacks the most in. They do have the ability to make kind of, dumb bombs, unguided bombs, but they don't have as strong ability to make the really precision guided munitions that we have seen them using in really, really dark ways in this war. So that's where, of course, the U.S. comes in and they provide these weapons. So, again, this is what we're dealing with. And they essentially just apparently went, sent this letter into Tel Aviv. It's like, do you sign this, terms and conditions here? And essentially that was what happened. There was no independent investigation here. But the Biden administration, though, will now have 90 days to provide Congress with a report on whether the Israeli government has abided by its assurances, which is sure to be interesting. The determination by the administration comes despite recent opposition from progressives in Congress to rule that the Israeli government's assurances were credible. The current circumstances on the ground in Gaza and many statements made by the president and other administration officials and the recent IPC assessment that, quote, famine is imminent. Also, by the way, again, this little aid part in this whole story as well, I think is pretty critical. One of the conditions not just was that you use the weapons in accordance with humanitarian law, but also that you do not stop in any way the United States from blocking aid. And they gave that letter to Israel. They said, of course we're not blocking aid. But then they're like, wait, hey, you're not blocking aid. Netanyahu's government is not doing nearly enough to allow aid to reach starving and otherwise desperate people in Gaza. When they're literally, again, not doing enough is one way of putting it, literally shooting the recipients of aid in Gaza Strip by, the IDF was what they're doing. We've seen multiple times, killing hundreds of people trying to wait for aid is, that's a whole nother level. That is just, doing literally the opposite of what the paper says. As a result, we believe it would be inconsistent with the letter and spirit of NSM 20 to find that the assurances made by Netanyahu government meet the required credible and reliable standard at this time. Such a determination would establish an unacceptable precedent for the application of National Security Memo 20 in other situations around the world. The letter's signatories included people like Chris Van Hollen, Tim Kaine, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Chris Murphy. 6 House Democrats made a similar case on a letter sent on March 23rd. Given the catastrophic and evolving humanitarian situation in Gaza, we urge you to enforce the Humanitarian Aid Corridor Act, Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, as required by law, and make clear to the Israeli government that so long as Israel continues to restrict the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, the continued provision of U.S. security assistance to Israel would constitute a direct violation of existing U.S. law and must be restricted. And again, it almost feels like too basic even to say at this point, but yet another instance of U.S. policy appearing to be super hard, appearing to be, we require assurances, we require this, we require that, but then just having no teeth after all, and just sending it to a random Israeli to say, oh, sign this, that you're doing a good job, and then, look, they say they're doing a good job. Like, that's essentially what it comes down to when, push comes to shove. All right. Other important stuff to get to across the region. The Israeli military has imposed ongoing sieges on at least 3 medical facilities in the besieged enclave, including Al-Shifa Hospital in northern Gaza, entering its 7th day under siege yet again today. We're getting some really disturbing reports of massacres around the complex. Farouk Mohammed Hamd told Al Jazeera, who's a teenage Palestinian boy, he witnessed Israeli soldiers executing a group of 8 people, including his father and brother, inside the Al-Shifa Hospital. He said he and the others were stripped of their clothing and moved several times inside the Al-Shifa Hospital building in central Gaza over the course of hours before being taken to the top floor of the facility. They left us there for about 3 hours. They then said, "You are safe. You can go south." We stood up, but then they opened fire. We all laid down on the floor again. Then the snipers entertained themselves by shooting us one after the other. Haman said that his father told him to, before being killed, and you're sitting next to your dad, you're lying there, they're torturing, doing God knows what, taken to the top floor of the facility, and then they are allowed to go south, and then just, it's an absolute sick psychological manipulation, just absolutely playing with the lives of other human beings, because they don't view them as people. They just view them as animals. They view them as people they can play games with. And, how do I know it? It's because they've said it. Haman said his father told him before being killed to run away if he could, and he managed to run, but not seeing the unresponsive bodies of the executed group, which included the poor boy's father. Oh, it's just beyond comprehension. Jamil al-Ayubi, one of the thousands of Palestinians sheltering in the hospital, saw Israeli tanks and armed bulldozers drive over at least 4 bodies in the hospital courtyard. AP News reports the ambulances were also crushed. He says Karim Ayman Hatat, who lived in a 5-story building about 100 meters or 328 feet from the hospital, told AP he's hid in his kitchen for days, waiting as explosions shook the building. From time to time, the tank would fire a shell. It was to terrorize us, he said. MSF added that Israeli forces have carried out a mass arrest campaign of medical staff and other people, that the organization is deeply concerned for the safety of those detained. Meanwhile, 2 Al-Amal and Nasser hospitals have been under siege in Khan Yunis for the last 24 hours, according to Hani Mahmoud of Al Jazeera. Palestinian Red Crescent gave their latest update on the situation in Al-Amal on Sunday afternoon, saying Israeli tanks and armored vehicles have completely surrounded all entrances to the hospital and control any movement in and out. Israeli forces attacked the hospital earlier on Sunday, surrounding with tanks and forcing nearly everyone inside, from patients to displaced Palestinians sheltering there, to evacuate. What we're getting confirmed from Al-Amal Hospital is that not only has it been under constant bombing and tank shells, but loudspeakers are ordering people inside the hospital to come out with only their underwear on, and that has been confirmed by multiple sources and witnesses on the ground who have managed to flee the harrowing situation. The PCRS Red Crescent announced on Sunday evening they'd lost radio contact with the staff at the hospital. While all displaced Palestinians and patients who could move independently were evacuated toward the Al-Mawasi area of Khan Yunis, hospital staff remain, along with 9 patients and their 10 companions in a displaced family with children who have disabilities. PCRS says all of them need to be safely evacuated. Witnesses at Al-Shifa have reported the Palestinian women have been subjected to rape, torture, and execution by Israeli forces, just fitting with general reports of depravity that we've seen. Reem al-Salem, UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, said in a post on X that's abhorrent that any reports of rape by Israeli forces keep coming out without any consequences. Rape and other forms of sexual violence constitute war crimes against humanity or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. It must stop, she says. There was one report about Al Jazeera, from Al Jazeera, with the interview of some woman who said, I think, it was immediately clarified, I think, which is telling, especially when we get to our next story, it'll be telling that they immediately clarified it and said that this woman, essentially in the interview said, she had made it up to try and bring more sympathy to the martyrs, but there also have been many other, kind of independent reports of rape, both by witnesses and by human rights and other news organizations, both prior to, obviously, October 7th and ongoing in the Israeli invasion since October 7th. So I think it's important to say. Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory, similarly said, I lost count of how many renowned journalists interviewed me on the alleged mistreatment of sexual abuse against Palestinian women by Israeli forces and never published any article on this, which is very, very interesting to see how these articles apparently are happening with somebody who has a high place in the UN, and these interviews are taking place, but what do we see? No follow-through on any of it. Meanwhile, at Gaza's European hospital near Khan Yunis, one of the last long-stay medical facilities, medical staff report horrific scenes with patients dying from infections with evidence of serious malnutrition. Hussam Bashir, orthopedic surgeon working in the hospital, said he and his staff are managing with the bare minimum of resources at the medical facility due to Israeli restrictions on medical aid entering the besieged enclave. Meanwhile, the UN Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, announced on Sunday that Israel has officially barred it from making aid deliveries in northern Gaza, where the threat of famine is the highest. And it's all shows a joke, and shows the United States is completely unserious about getting aid in, because this would be an outrage. This is the UN. This is a respected body where no evidence against it has been proven over months, and the evidence that has been brought up has been shown to be absolutely laughable and debunked, and hardly any evidence at all, just accusations that are evidence-free that have been presented to the EU. and to other countries, with some of them, I think, including the EU as well, is trying to consider turning funding back on. But the U.S., the biggest funder, Germany, I think is the second biggest funder, which I don't know how that happened to turn out, but they have refused to turn back on any funding, and they are, U.S. especially, is unwilling to use any sort of leverage, unwilling to use any sort of special, thing or benefits of the special relationship that they have with Israel to force them to say, let UNRWA live, let UNRWA put aid back in. This is what you absolutely need to do, because they are supporters of Israel. They're supporters of what Israel is doing, and they know that Israel is very, very serious about stopping UNRWA from existing because of its support of the Palestinian refugees and the reaffirmation of Palestinians as refugees, which is something that they want to wipe out. They want to wipe out the idea that Palestinian could be a nationality in the first place, that you could be a refugee from that state and have Palestine as your birthplace in the first place, which is it's incredibly disturbing. And it really does show that there is no one really standing in the way in any significant way to stop Israel from doing some of the worst and most depraved things, and just not letting, again, life-saving aid get to this area in exchange for helping Israel commit one of their biggest ideological goals. Is it's pretty disturbing. All right. With that being said, we're going to move on to our next story. And it's a quick little one, but it's important. Jeremy Scahill has this. On March 4th, The Intercept published a story on how in Kibbutzberry, the official government of Kibbutzberry denied a report in the New York Times regarding the sexual assault of 2 girls on October 7th. The NYT said they stood by their reporting. Now, the NYT has just reported on a new video that was filmed by an Israeli soldier who discovered the girls in the wake of the October 7th attack that completely undermines the New York Times report. And the New York Times is now quoting kibbutz residents saying that this original report was completely false and this girl was never raped. Yet the New York Times has not retracted, edited, or in any way corrected the original Screams Without Words story, which has won a Polk Award and is consistently cited as the definitive account of systemic sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th. The New York Times has serious questions to answer about this false story and how it made its way into the paper of record. The story about the new video is on the website. Instead of retracting and issuing a correction, the New York Times added an update that constitutes a spin job within its original story aimed at exonerating itself for not actually verifying such a serious allegation before printing it. Okay, so here's an update. Not a retraction, not a correction of any kind. No admission of wrongdoing. Newly released video viewed by The Times showed the bodies of the 2 teenage girls in Kibbutzberry fully clothed, undercutting this account from an Israeli, again, which is just like, Israeli military allowed the paramedic to speak with the reporters on the condition to not be identified because he serves in an elite unit. Apparently this paramedic was connected by Elam Levy to a lot of different, major media, Western media outlets, but was unidentified because he serves in an elite unit in the military. But they say, newly released video by The Times shows the bodies, or video viewed by The Times shows the bodies of 2 teenage girls in Kibbutzberry, fully clothed, undercutting the account from Israeli paramedic who recovered bodies in multiple occasions after an October 7th attack. It was unclear if the paramedic was describing bodies he discovered elsewhere. So again, just completely cop out, just like really just, and then, this is not even at the bottom. Just drop this in, update, and they're really just having the amount of just like little updates, the amount of changes, like stealth edits they've made, have made it increasingly harder for them to go through the story without a retraction. But it is at least they're putting in some sort of update, but they're doing in the most spinning, kind of justifying and misleading way possible. It remains surreal that this text appears at the bottom of the New York Times Screams Without Words story as they defiantly refuse to issue a correction to demonstrably false assertions printed in the story. Scahill tweets, and he includes the picture of this little bit at the bottom of the New York Times article. when we learn of a mistake, we acknowledge it with a correction. If you spot an error, please let us know at nytnews@nytimes.com. So it's kind of a joke. And meanwhile, on January 5th, the award-winning journalist Layla Aran privately wrote to the New York Times to point out problems with the story, including raising credibility questions about their sources in the she's the executive producer at Al Jazeera English. She wrote to the New York Times about the questions of credibility regarding the Caboose Berry story back on January 5th, by the way, and the New York Times never responded to her. One important detail is the paramedic the New York Times used as a source for this only gave estimates of the girls' ages. It was stated in the New York, according to the New York Times. It was the New York Times that stated specific ages, making it possible to identify the alleged victims. This is relevant to exposing how dishonest the New York Times spin in the face of the new information that shows what they printed was false. They are implying there might be other victims that fit his description, and their source might have just got the location wrong. But it was the New York Times, not the source, who signed the specific ages. They have a lot of explaining to do. Don't hold your breath. It'll happen. When you talk about, which, organization reported, through or hosted interviews of someone who made false accusations of rapes, and you talk about which organization responded and handled, if you're looking at New York Times and Al Jazeera, and which organization handled the false reporting of rape allegations professionally and immediately debunked it once they knew, then, and which organization is considered a mainstream paper of record and legendary paper, it's not Al Jazeera. It's just like they're not the ones who are considered the paper of record, but they handled this infinitely more professionally than New York Times when they had a, not even analogous, but, slightly similar situation in that the allegation was the same, but New York Times, spun this up, made it a much bigger deal than even some of the Israeli sources said it turned to be, as we saw with the providing of the ages there in the first place in the New York Times story, and now are refusing to make any sort of update, any sort of apology or correction. Or they've made an update, but they have not admitted in any way that they misreported the story. All right, I do want to move now to a bit more of what we have been seeing with regards to the election. So it is just very, very interesting. We have the Real Clear Politics average. We have the 538 polling, amalgamation service, I guess you could say. And if you pull up Real Clear Politics at this time, and you look at the classic Real Clear Politics 2024 election latest 2024 polls, and we've seen really kind of consistent polls, and also, by the way, Biden really doing pretty poorly in almost all battleground states except for Pennsylvania, which is interesting. We have seen the Real Clear average start to kind of tighten up a little bit, with it's now down to the current average is Trump plus 1.7. And we have seen some of the last polls really, this is a big Reuters Ipsos poll that had Biden up by 2. There is a Civics poll that had Biden up by 1. And then there was a Seltzer poll that, kind of had Trump up 7. So it's definitely getting more into clear Trump towards flip a coin territory. But then you still have a lot of the, and it's interesting to say they also have in the Real Clear Politics polls, March 25th, 2020, Biden was up by 7. March 25th, 2016, Clinton was up by 11 at this point, and now Trump is up by 1.7. But if we go look at some of the battleground states, you go Arizona, Trump has a 5.4 Real Clear Politics average from, at least the last two polls that were conducted in March have Trump up by 4. If you go to a state like Pennsylvania, you see a relatively closer situation with a Susquehanna poll having Biden up 5, a Franklin and Marshall. Actually, this is much further back, but a recent CNN poll had a tie in Pennsylvania. But then you look at states like Wisconsin, look at states like Michigan. Trump also up by a pretty sizable amount, although there just has not been really enough polling done at the moment. The most recent was the Hill Emerson in Wisconsin that had Trump up by 4. But either way, looking at the situation here, looking at the two bases and then kind of these swing voters, I think the probably the most important people to watch are going to be those new suburban Democrats. I said a big reason why they were kind of turning away from just general feelings about Trump, or turning away towards Trump, turning away from Biden was largely because it was handling the economy, and just much more broadly, though, I think the feeling of his age, the feeling of general incompetence, and him not really being able to handle and manage any of the crises that he boosted. A booster wouldn't be the right, just had to deal with, and just in the eyes of the American people, not being those American people not being any real steady hand in the way that he said that he was. Also, I think the age kind of factors into that as well. But those are the same people who were kind of drifting more towards Biden, but in the recent polling that shows him down, are drifting away. In addition to the problems that you have with base turnout and base enthusiasm in the Democratic Party. But I think some of this moving is, and you see it in Pennsylvania, which is kind of the big Philadelphia suburbs. I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see it looking a little bit better in Georgia, but Georgia, much more of a more recent past as a red state, I think it's important to say. So that plays in as well. Is those suburban voters who, as Trump gets back into the news, we see more things about him being, a criminal every single day, saying crazier things, saying these, horrific things about immigrants, and people just getting reminded why they really didn't like him and voted him out in 2020. We're going to start to see a little bit more of that improvement. But then it comes to, can Biden hold up his end of the bargain with regards to age, with regards to managing some of these crises and not having any, more crazy moments out in public or anything like that? Well, I think it's going to be, a push and pull that will probably end up being the deciding factor. Again, the key stat in all this is, of the people who say they hate both, who do those people vote for? And whoever that person is going to be the next president. All right. That's all we got. We're back on Wednesday. It's Newsflash.